Reply to Mr Stewart Hosie.
Thank you, Madam Deputy Speaker. I think there are 4 significant flaws with this piece of legislation. The absence of devolved consent, real protections for the NHS, the preservation of food standards and meaningful parliamentary scrutiny. I believe our Amendment 10 and new clauses 7 and 8 deal with the first 3, and the Honourable Gentleman from Huntingdon's new clause 4 deals with the final issue. I wish to move the Amendment 10 and new clauses 7 and 8 in my name, Madam Deputy Speaker, and I'll start slightly in reverse order with Amendment 10. It relates to the powers of the devolved administrations, or as I said in committee, more accurately, the ability of the UK Government to make regulations under subsection 1, which make provisions within devolved competencies without the consent of Scottish or Welsh Ministers or a Northern Irish devolved authority granting consent. And it strikes me as fundamental that if we are to genuinely respect the devolved settlement in the UK, then Ministers must self-evidently gain the consent of the devolved administrations before making changes to regulations which directly affect them, and possibly in a negative way or in a way which runs counter to those government's policy objectives. Now, I am aware in the previous trade bill under consideration between 17 and 19, there was a problematic provision for regulation-making powers to be available to the UK Government, but the good news is those provisions have been removed from this trade bill. But it is the case there remains no statutory obligation for the UK Government to even consult, let alone seek the consent of Scottish Ministers before exercising the powers in this bill in devolved areas. Now, I know that the Minister has said those powers would not normally be used without seeking consent, and his predecessor did offer a number of non-legislative commitments to the Scottish Trade Minister Ivan McKee in March, and I am genuinely pleased that the Minister, during the committee proceedings of the bill, committed to honouring those non-legislative commitments. He said, and this is in column 240 in Hansard on the 23rd of June, I restate the commitments made by my right honourable friend when he was Minister in his March letter to the Scottish Minister Ivan McKee, and that is genuinely very welcome. However, he went on to say, in opposing what was then Amendment 8 and similar Labour new clauses that dealt with the same issues, in short, and I am quoting, we are already delivering the engagement envisaged by proposed new clauses, and we have achieved that while continuing to observe the important constitutional principles enshrined in the devolution settlement. I disagree, Madam Deputy Speaker. Giving the UK Government the ability to directly affect devolved powers without the statutory requirement to even seek consent is not observing the devolved settlement. He went, I'll give way briefly, yes.
Thank you for giving way. And obviously the trading ability is something which concerns each and every one of us across the whole of the United Kingdom of Great Britain and Northern Ireland. Can I ask the right honourable gentleman, would he be prepared to support new clause 4, which would give the authority to devolve assemblies in Scottish Parliament and further comes to the floor of this House for ratification? Surely supporting new clause 4 would be a step to make that happen as well.
I'm more than happy to support new clause 4, not least because I've signed it. But it's a slightly different thing. I think ensuring parliamentary scrutiny, and I'll come to say a little more about that later, is important, but it is different to seeking consent from those administrations whose policies or policy direction may be affected by a UK Government decision. However, the Minister went on to say, in terms of the new clause we debated in committee, very similar to this one, in fact identical, this proposed new clause would give the devolved administrations a statutory role in the reserved area of international trade negotiations, which would be constitutionally inappropriate. Well, he's partly right in that the amendment would give the devolved administrations a statutory role, but only insofar as the provisions of a trade deal affected devolved competences. That is not constitutionally inappropriate. It's a matter of good administration and respect. However, his key argument against what was proposed, and I'm quoting, is that it was not practical. He said, and I quote, "It would lock us and the devolved administrations into prescribed ways of working under the existing Intergovernmental Memorandum of Understanding, a document last updated in 2013. Well, that may be an argument for revisiting the MOU. It might also be an argument to say the government should adhere to the terms of the MOU under any circumstances. But it's a very strange argument for opposing this amendment. Surely it's better to base negotiations on an agreed framework, better still an agreed statutory framework, rather than to leave them up to chance, make up the rules on the hoof and give an impression of the UK government acting in an arbitrary way. His key argument, however, was as follows. He said, as parts of these agreements touch on devolved matters, the legislation will create concurrent powers, and we've sought to put in place concurrent powers to provide greater flexibility in how transitional agreements are implemented. So far, so good. However, he said, this approach permits greater administrative efficiency, reducing the volume of legislation brought through the UK Parliament and through the devolved legislatures. It cannot be right that the UK Government intends to legislate or can legislate in the areas of devolved competence for the sake of administrative efficiency. There are far bigger and wider principles at stake than that. If I may now turn to new clause 7 in my name. We know that trade deals can put pressure on food standards and can lead to the importation of low-standard food. We know that the US administration, for example, has made clear it wants the UK to lower its food and animal welfare standards. This new clause 7, includes a ban on the importation of food which is produced to standards lower than that in the UK. We also know that the US and other countries have far lower animal welfare standards and adopt practices which are illegal in the UK for health and environmental reasons, including chlorine-washed chicken, hormone-fed beef, the use of various pesticides and GM crops. None of this is a great surprise to anyone in the House. And we believe that the quality of Scotland's food and drink produce, and indeed food and drink produced elsewhere in the UK, and their standards are essential to maintaining our established international reputation in those areas. So I'll give way briefly, yes.
I wonder whether the people in Scotland, as the people in England and in my constituency in Winchester, might not just be way ahead of the politicians. Because ultimately, won't the consumer decide? Just recently, we heard Waitrose make it very, very clear that they wouldn't be selling any product that was imported to a lower standard than we currently enjoy in this country. And their new boss actually quoted chlorine-washed chicken. I just wonder whether the public might be ahead of us on this one already.
I want to be very careful how I answer this, and I hope that the honourable gentleman understands. Perhaps those who can afford to shop in Waitrose. I know the Minister boasted about this during committee. He was a Waitrose fan. Perhaps they have a choice. Perhaps somebody who's counting every penny and doesn't have access to anything other than the cheapest of food is not in the same position to make the same choice. So this new clause effectively does two things. It affirms the UK's rights and obligations under the SPS agreement, that is the application of the sanitary and phytosanitary measures in Appendix 1A of the WTO agreement, and it prohibits the import of food into the UK if standards in the exporting country are lower than those in force in the UK. And I don't think there's anything contentious about that. And of course, it's not just campaign groups like the Trade Justice Movement who back this. It's not just Scottish Land and Estates and the NFU who back measures like this. The BMA have weighed into this debate and said this bill presents an opportunity for the UK to present itself as a global leader on standards on food imports for the benefit of human, animal and plant health and the environment. To fulfil this opportunity, it's vital that our current high standards are upheld and protected in any trade deals, and they suggest this new Clause 7 and new Clause 11 should be backed in order to achieve that. It's also necessary to have this on the face of the bill because the government's approach to protecting food standards is slightly confused. In committee, this is column 305 on the 25th of June, the Minister said this bill is about continuity. The imports under continuity agreements must continue to comply with our existing import standards, and I welcome that. But in column 306, he said, decisions on standards are a matter for the UK and will be made separately from any trade agreement. And there's the concern right there, that the UK could, if it wished, lower standards, opening the door to all sorts of horrors. So let's make sure, at least in the rollover arrangements, that is not possible by including the UK's obligations under the WTO. The sanitary and phytosanitary agreement are written onto the face of the bill. It's also important because although the purported objectives of this bill are about rollovers, the definition of trade agreements is very wide, and the long title does not restrict its use only to rollovers. And if I can turn finally to new clause 8. This new clause would ensure that the UK Government has a duty to restrict market access to healthcare services, including medicines and medical devices. And we've tabled this amendment precisely because trade deals do have the potential to negatively impact on health services. Now, while the UK Government has repeatedly pledged that the NHS is not on the table in trade negotiations, we know that leaked documents have detailed conversations between UK and US negotiators revealing that health services have been discussed, including the US probing the UK's quotes, health insurance system, and the US has made it clear its desire for the UK to change its drug pricing mechanism. So this new clause includes specific carve-outs for the NHS, all relevant services and regulation, meaning it would be illegal for the Government to conclude a trade agreement which altered the way NHS services are provided, or liberalised further, or opened up to particular sorts of foreign investment. No use of negative listing, because such clauses require that all industries are liberalised in trade agreements unless there are specific carve-outs, and it isn't always easy to define what services count as health services. For example, digital services may seem irrelevant to health, but NHS data management, GP appointment systems are increasingly digitised. No standstill or ratchet clauses, because these provisions mean that after the trade deal has been signed, parties are not allowed to reduce the level of liberalisation beyond what it was at the point of signature. Now, there are many examples of how this could impact in the real world. I'll give one example only briefly. The Scottish Government had private cleaners in the NHS and quite a high degree of hospital-acquired infection. The private cleaners were replaced by NHS cleaners, and the level of hospital-acquired infection fell dramatically. Had a ratchet been in effect, let alone ISDS, it may not have been possible to do that, with detrimental mortality and morbidity consequences for real patients. Now, I mentioned ISDS. This clause also says there should be no investor-state dispute clauses, settlement clauses in trade agreements, which only allow private investors to challenge government policy when it affects their profits. And again, if I can refer to the BMA, who have also piled into this debate, they have said the bill must rule out investor protection and dispute resolution mechanisms, which undermine the supremacy of the UK courts, prevent the rollback of privatisation, and risk deterring, delaying or blocking health improvement measures. And we've seen examples around the world of where that has happened. It is fundamentally quite wrong for large corporations to use ISDS-type arrangements to be able to sue governments simply for taking steps to protect the well-being of their citizens or for enacting public health measures which they believe to be right and for which they may well have an electoral mandate. And I'll give way one more time.
I'm very grateful to the honourable gentleman. I think he's making a fine speech. Does he agree with me that it seems a considerable irony that those on the other side of the chamber who were so determined that this country should not be subject to any supranational court system should hereby, in an ISDS clause, enable our Parliament, our government, to be sued by foreign companies in specialist supranational courts in a way that isn't even accessible to our own domestic companies?
Yes, and I made that point. It's wrong to have these provisions available only to investors in the way has just been described. I mean, if we want a supranational body which adjudicates, arbitrates and works, let's have the UK government put some pressure on the friends in the United States and get the WTO appellate body back up and running and functioning again. That would be the best thing for trade around the entire world. The new clause also instructs there should be no changes to drug pricing mechanisms. This could also happen through IP and non-patent exclusivities. This would be bad news for patients, taxpayers, health boards and trusts around the country, and our view is that trade deals should not be used to facilitate this. Now, in opposing an amendment like this, or a new clause like this in the committee stage, the Minister said, and this starts in column 315 on the 25th of June, the NHS is not and never will be for sale to the private sector. Fine. He said, we've always protected our right to choose how we would deliver public services and trade agreements, and will continue to do so. His argument was fundamentally, and I'm quoting, however laudable the new clauses were, they were unnecessary. And he went on to explain that the UK already had rigorous checks and balances on the government's power to negotiate and ratify trade agreements via the Constitutional Reform and Governance Act 2010, CRAG. There are two big issues which jump out from this, given what the Minister said, and I have it in full if he wants to reread it. Firstly, there is absolutely no practical reasons at all why protections for the NHS demanded by the public should not be included on the face of the bill. And secondly, and more importantly, because the so-called rigorous checks and balances in CRAG described amount to little more than a take-it-or-leave-it choice at the end of the negotiations, the need to protect the NHS from the outset in legislation is paramount. So, Madam Deputy Speaker, I commend Amendment 10 and new clauses 7 and 8 to the House, and I do hope, time permitting, we can press a vote on new clause 7 and Amendment 10.